Hello friends, my name is Michelle Fondin and I'm the author of Help, I Think My Loved One is an Alcoholic, a survival guide for lovers, family, and friends. Today I'm going to talk to you about what if your alcoholic loved one relapses in early sobriety or in sobriety in general. For a loved one of an alcoholic, it can be extremely frustrating when you think that your alcoholic is on the road to recovery and then all of a sudden, out of the clear blue, they come home drunk with the smell of alcohol in their breath, or you know that they've disappeared once again to seek out drugs or alcohol. It can be extremely disheartening. So for me, when my alcoholic loved one first relapsed, now let me preface this by saying, it's not certain that once your alcoholic gets into recovery that he or she will relapse. However, the probability is pretty high. When you're ending any bad habit, whether it's to stop smoking, going on a diet to lose weight, cutting out sugar or carbs, any bad habit that you're trying to stop is extremely hard. For an alcoholic, this is an extremely hard thing. Alcoholism is multifaceted, as I've said in other videos. So it's not only the physical and chemical addiction, but it's the psychological addiction, the spiritual addiction. It really takes over the alcoholic's entire life, and it's really like their best friend. It's like their best friend, and it's something that they've relied upon for years and years and years, and it can be extremely difficult to let go of that trusted friend. So just know this, know that if your alcoholic loved one does indeed relapse, he or she is not a failure at sobriety. It's that it takes a lot of practice, a lot of commitment. It takes a lot of honesty. Honesty with themselves, honesty with God, honesty with other people. And they really need to be working the steps, working with a sponsor, and attending meetings daily once they're out of a rehab or detox facility. So let me just tell you a little bit about my story. When my alcoholic loved one relapsed, in the beginning when he had come out of detox and he promptly relapsed, I had really, really high expectations about how he was going to handle sobriety. And I really, it's a long-awaited moment. You go through your life with your alcoholic loved one, whether that alcoholic loved one is your mother, sister, brother, best friend, spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend. You go through life with them with this expectation that maybe someday they will get sober, and you hope that they'll transform into a different person or the person that you had always hoped they would be. Life isn't that easy, and personal transformations aren't that easy either. So if you've ever tried to make a major life choice in order to make a change, it's huge. So I had these grandiose high expectations that everything would be peachy, that we'd get our happily ever after, that everything would be wonderful and flowery, and we'd come together kind of like in a romantic movie, a romantic comedy movie where, you know, we'd just come together and be in love for the rest of our lives. And that's really not the way it went down. Shortly after detox, he did make the decision to go back to drinking, and I was completely devastated. I didn't know what to do, and I handled it really poorly. I tried to control the situation. I did so many things to try to control his sobriety, and at that particular moment, he just didn't want it. He didn't want to get sober. He had made the conscious choice that, yes, this is something I need to do, but it's not really something he wanted to do at that particular moment. So if your alcoholic loved one does relapse in early sobriety, or even after being sober for 5 to 10 years, you have to know that it's that person's journey. It's not your fault. It's not anybody else's fault. It's that the inner power that comes from within, that inner willingness to get and stay sober, needs to be there in your alcoholic loved one in order for them to get and stay sober. It's really important. It has to come from within. If it comes from any external forces, as soon as those external forces are gone, then your alcoholic loved one will likely go back to drinking. So it really is a personal transformation coupled with a faith in a higher power, as well as working a program. So the first time I handled it really badly. I mean, I had the breathalyzers, the drug tests. It was forcefully forcing him to go to meetings and all kinds of conditions. And honestly, it was really exhausting because when you try to control somebody else's behavior, it's exhausting because that's not in the natural course of things. You're not supposed to do that. So I was the one that was becoming exhausted, and he was the one that was becoming resentful, and it just didn't work. The next time that my alcoholic loved one did relapse, I decided to handle it a little bit differently. I decided that maybe I didn't have to judge so harshly, that maybe I could look at it as just a little slip up, and that the next day would be better. The next day he could attend a meeting, and the next day things would be right back on track. So I didn't try to make him feel guilty. I didn't try to point the finger and accuse. I just said, well, why did this happen? Or do you know why this happened? And tried to have a very little conversation. Now, he was really scared because of what had happened previously and my reactions. However, I think that fear just stemmed from he didn't want to go back to where we were, and I really didn't want to go back to where we were because it wasn't a pleasant thing for either him or me. So when I reacted differently, he was then able to also react differently. And it was really a more enlightening experience in both of our processes. So the first thing that you need to do if your alcoholic loved one does relapse is just remember that sobriety is your alcoholic loved one's job, and it's not your job. You can take a hands-off approach in the sense that you're not controlling his or her sobriety, you're not in charge of his or her sobriety, and you're not certainly in charge of his or her program. So that's one thing you just need to remember. And it really does take the weight off of your shoulders to know that you're not the one in charge here. You have your own recovery that needs to take place. I highly encourage you to work the 12 steps, work with a sponsor or a counselor, get into groups if that's where you feel comfortable. But, working on your own recovery is really important, and mirroring the 12 steps with your alcoholic loved one is really important because the 12 steps are very, very good for self-exploration, spiritual connection, becoming a better person overall. Hands off, it's not your program, it's his or hers, and that's the first step you need to remember. The second step you need to remember is not to overreact. Try not to overreact. I know this is really hard for me. I will admit that. It has been hard in the past. It still is hard in the present. I really have to make a conscious effort to not overreact when something happens that I'm not pleased about. But it's better to give that person the benefit of the doubt, that they need to make their own choices and they need to suffer the consequences of their own choices. And some of those consequences are just internal consequences. So that if you overreact as someone who loves an alcoholic who's in recovery and who has relapsed, then when you overreact, you're putting your emotions, your negative emotions on that person. And when you put your negative emotions on top of that person, they're going to backlash at you. They're going to throw those negative emotions back in your face. And it will give them more justification for what they did, for going back to drinking or drug using. Because they can say, you put so much pressure on me, or look at all this negative energy you're giving to me, and that's the reason why I went back to drinking. So you don't really want to give them a reason or a scapegoat. You want them to be able to feel their own guilt and shame. You want them to be able to feel the consequences of their own choices. The third thing you can do is have a plan in place. If your alcoholic loved one is living with you, if it's a spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend, best friend, an adult child, one of your children who is an alcoholic in recovery, have a plan in place so that the living situation can have boundaries. It's really important and well needed for a living situation for an alcoholic who is in recovery to have those safe parameters, have those safe boundaries. For example, it's really encouraged that you don't have alcohol or drugs in the home. And any temptations like that is really going to hurt your alcoholic loved one's chances of getting better. And that includes prescription pills that might be addictive. So really anything, cough syrups, mouthwash that has alcohol in it, And even cooking, you know, if you have a bottle of wine for cooking, throw it out. There are many alternatives to cooking with alcohol. So having that safe space, but also having a plan in place. The plan in place is something that you and your alcoholic loved one who's in recovery decide together, so that you know what the protocol is if he or she should relapse. So in the early recovery, it's really hard for them to admit that they have had a relapse, and it's really hard for them to admit to another person that they've indeed relapsed. So you can just have an understanding that, well, if you do relapse, then we're going to go to a meeting together the very next day. And you find an open AA meeting and you go to the meeting together. Or you can say, if you do relapse, I'll just remind you that you need to call your sponsor. And so you're really putting recovery on the top of the list if your alcoholic loved one does relapse and they are living in the same living situation as you, and you want to make it peaceful. You want to make sure that you're not carrying the burden of your alcoholic loved one's relapse. And one way to do this is kind of throw the relapse back into the program. And if your alcoholic loved one refuses to go to a meeting or call his or her sponsor, a good way is just to keep hands off for a while and maybe wait for a 24-hour period until, because obviously you never want to talk to an alcoholic when they've got alcohol in their bodies. They react. They don't have the same reasoning capacities that you have. They think about things differently. They have these hardcore internal reactions that have been hardwired for years and years and years, and these are defense mechanisms that they've used to push other people away. These are defense mechanisms that they've used to stay in denial. So you never really want to start reasoning with an alcoholic when they're under the influence of drugs or alcohol. It's pointless. It just doesn't get anywhere. So you can wait till the next day and say, hey, do you remember that we had an agreement about us living together in the same space, that while you're in recovery, if you do relapse, we're going to head to a meeting or call your sponsor or whatever it is that you guys decide together in order to make the living situation more peaceful. Another thing is, if your alcoholic loved one does relapse and he or she makes the decision to stay in the situation where he or she is drinking on a continual basis, you might need to, as a loved one with parameters and boundaries, you might need to take other measures in hand. So you might need to create a loving ultimatum for your alcoholic loved one. And this is something also that can be discussed prior to a relapse. You can say, well, you know, if you decide to relapse and continue to relapse, then you agree to go into detox. And so when that happens, and if it happens, there's no guarantee that it's actually going to happen, but if it does, then you can put the plan into place and say, okay, this is the third time in 1 week that you've relapsed. Get your bags ready. Let's go to detox. So you have to have those boundaries in place so that the alcoholic who's in recovery really does know what to expect, and follow through with your plan. But really remember to treat others the way you want to be treated. And that really is the golden rule. So I'm sure there's been hundreds of thousands of times in your life where you set out to do something really good and you fell short. I'm sure it happens even every day. It does for me. I know that for certain. So that you've fallen short. And you forget those things. When it comes to your fixation with your alcoholic loved one, you forget that each and every day you fall short of your own expectations. So maybe you said, hey, I'm not going to eat any sweets today, and then somebody at work brought in a donut or brought in a cake. It was some celebration or birthday, and you had a piece of cake, and you went against what you said you were going to do. So just know that nobody is perfect, and there is an expression in AA that says progress and not perfection. So it really is about progress and not perfection. Your alcoholic loved one's sobriety will never be perfect. It won't be perfect. It is a progress. It is a process, and it takes time. just as anything takes time. So think about your life. Just go over your life when you're quick to judge and you're quick to admonish what's happening. Just go to yourself and say, you know, what things in my life have I tried to change that have been really difficult to change, and how have I fallen short of making those changes? And when you do that, when you put it back on yourself, you're a lot easier with your alcoholic loved one. You're less harsh, less judgmental, more compassionate, loving, and kind. And really, that's what we're seeking here. In this process, we're seeking to be kinder, gentler, sane people that we weren't when our alcoholic loved one was still drinking, and that we were still unaware of our own behavior and our own contribution to this process. So I'm wishing you a beautiful day. I'm wishing you much love and blessings to you. And please support me if you love these videos. I am producing a lot of videos these days and will continue as a service to produce these videos on loving an alcoholic, how to manage your relationship with your alcoholic loved one. So you can buy a book. You can support me on Patreon, www.patreon.com/michellefondin, my first and last name. Wishing you many blessings for the days to come.